Well, thank you for joining us for this webinar. It's entitled A Lens on Capital Punishment, the National Death Penalty Archive video series launch. I am Jim Acker. I'm an emeritus professor here at the University at Albany. Our primary objectives for this forum are twofold. We want to share with you information about the contents of the National Death Penalty Archive with the hope that it will get use by the public, researchers, scholars, to give you a sense of the storehouse of materials that are available in the National Death Penalty Archive. And our second objective is to encourage individuals, organizations that have materials related to capital punishment that should be preserved over time, made available so others can have access to them. And if you or an organization or a person that you know does have some materials of this nature concerning capital punishment, might consider contributing those materials to the archive, we would welcome those opportunities. And we'll give you information about how to contact us with respect to making possible contributions to the archive. Our agenda for today is going to wind itself out, I think, in fairly good order. We should be here perhaps 30 to 40 minutes. We're going to begin with a virtual tour of some of the materials that are in the archives to show some of the documents and give you a better sense of materials that you can find when you visit the archive, either in person or virtually. Then we will play some brief clips from interviews that were conducted with 8 experts in capital punishment to, again, just give a sense of some of the multiple issues that the death penalty evokes, and to hear a little bit about what these researchers and activists are thinking today. As we go, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, of the Zoom screen, an option for Q&A. So at any time as we go, please type in questions that you may have concerning anything that we bring up. And at the conclusion of our presentations, we'll be looking at the questions that have been posed, and we'll do our best to be responsive. So with that much by way of brief introduction, let me introduce Brian Keogh, who's the head of special collections here at the University of Albany Libraries. And Brian can give more background about the origins of the archive and other information that he can share. So Brian, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Acker. Again, my name is Brian Keogh. I am the co-director of the National Death Penalty Archive that's located here at the University at Albany. In 1999, the University at Albany School of Criminal Justice and the University Libraries established the National Death Penalty Archive, a national repository of primary sources and archival material devoted solely to documenting the history of capital punishment in the United States. This unique collection of materials is an unrivaled source for scholars, students, and the public interested in the legal, political, and social history of the death penalty. Why do we do this? Well, because researchers and historians use primary source records generated from organizations. They use the papers of individuals in order to interpret and write about the history of capital punishment. Scholars are interested in political and social movements, academic research on the topic, and about court cases that have shaped the history of this compelling and often contentious subject. Today, the National Death Penalty has over 40 archival collections totaling over 500 cubic feet of record boxes. As Dr. Acker mentioned, we actively seek new collections of historical records from individuals and organizations that had or have a significant influence in the political and academic discourse. We also seek grants and other forms of funding to expedite our work to acquire and to make accessible and in some cases digitized records about the past. So the first part of today's program is to show you selections from the different National Death Penalty Archive collections. Jody Boyle, an archivist at the University at Albany, who's worked with the National Death Penalty Archive for over a decade, will now present a selection of sources from the National Death Penalty Archive. Jody?
Hi, thank you. I'm Jody Boyle. I'm the supervisory archivist here at the Emmy Grenander Department of Special Collections and Archives. Let's get started looking at some selections from our National Death Penalty Archive. I'd like to begin looking at Michael Meltzner's papers. His papers demonstrate the wonderful ways that our National Death Penalty Archive collections intersect. In Professor Meltzner's collection, you might find materials written by Hugo Bedeau or David Baldus or others whose collections that we hold. But what I want to share today is an August 1976 Newsday op-ed written while Professor Meltzner was still a law professor at Columbia. It's written in response to recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions that revived the death penalty. It's an analysis that breaks down the complications of the legal system and the legal decision process for a general audience. And it explains the implications of the justices' decisions. The David Baldus papers document the distinguished legal career of David Baldus, which includes sophisticated challenges to capital punishment in the United States since its reinstatement in 1976, which Meltz explained. While most well known in the Baldus papers is material from the Georgia Charging and Sentencing Study, which was used as evidence in the 1987 McCleskey versus Kemp U.S. Supreme Court decision, I'd like to share with you today something perhaps less familiar. In the early 2000s, Baldus and his team conducted statistical analysis of the Nebraska charging and sentencing system since 1973. And these are Professor Baldus's remarks to the Nebraska Judiciary Committee about the study's principal findings, including which defendants are charged with a capital crime, which defendants advance to the penalty phase of the trial, and which defendants are sentenced to death. Professor Mike Rattale scholarship also looks at defendants and the legal system, but as the Rattale papers document, his research and publications focus on innocence. His collection contains case files, correspondence, notes, and court records, which all illustrate the processes he employed to try to determine if a historic case involved an individual who was wrongfully convicted. For example, I have here files. Files for Frank Harris, convicted in 1926, and Miguel Arroyo, convicted in 1965. These are representative samples of many, many more case files that are within the collection. Both men were convicted and sent to prison for crimes they did not commit. In the case of Frank Harris, he was in prison for 21 years until a new lawyer, intervened with new ballistics information and early forensic and crime scene reconstructive data. And then he was freed. In the case of Miguel Arroyo, witnesses changed their stories. And then he was ultimately freed after just over a year in prison. The Capital Punishment Clemency Petition Collection was initially donated by Bill Bowers, and it has been added to by others over the years. The petitions are all digitized. They're available online through our website. The most recent edition was Lisa Marie Montgomery this winter. I'm holding the first few pages of her 51-page clemency petition. It was presented to then President Trump on December 24th, 2020. In her case, clemency was ultimately denied. Our National Death Penalty Archive collections also document abolitionist efforts. For instance, our department holds the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty records, and the largest portion of this collection contains the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty records case files. One of the most requested set of files by researchers belongs to Ozzie Kumbule, a South African child who faced the death penalty despite being under 18, despite being a bystander in a 1996 murder carjacking, despite no prior criminal record, and despite cooperating with authorities in Mississippi. The Ozzie Kumbule Committee for Justice binder, which is contained in this folder, prepared for a 1997 campaign, which was designed by the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. Their campaign was designed to raise awareness about the state of Mississippi's penchant to seek the death penalty against children, especially Black children. It was designed to raise funds, it was designed to provide talking points, and it was designed to educate the public. The Eugene G. Wanger and Marilyn M. Wanger Death Penalty Collection includes a wide range of materials on the death penalty, documenting its history, documenting efforts to abolish or reinstate the practice, its psychological impact, compatibility on religious, moral, or ethical grounds, and documenting its operation. It's a varied and unique collection. Consider just these 3 monographs. I have here 1915's By Right of the Sword. It's subtitled A Defense of Capital Punishment, based on a searching examination of history, theology, and philosophy. Conversely, we have 1903's The Men Behind Bars, or Lights and Shades of Prison Life, subtitled Methods of Reform Considered from a Christian Standpoint. And finally, I have the 1840 edition of Victor Hugo's The Last Days of a Condemned. Now, I think these 3 books illustrate the point of the collection. Efforts to abolish, efforts to proponents of the death penalty. I think these 3 books illustrate that point very neatly. And finally, my last comments are going to be about the Espy papers. Beginning in 1970, M. Watt Espy spent decades of his life researching executions in the United States. He gathered materials about them. He typed up index cards with information about individuals who were put to death. This is the index card for William Kemmler, who became the first person to die in the electric chair in 1890 in Auburn Correctional Facility in Western New York. Now, thanks to a grant, all these note cards in the Espy papers, and this box is just one of many boxes of index cards, all of these note cards in the Espy papers have been digitized, along with additional documentation of federal, state, military, and indigenous executions. Because of subsequent work our department is doing using open source technology, researchers will be able to go online and locate all the executions that Espy documented in a particular state or territory. But you'll also be able to search across states. So if you want to find out who else Espy uncovered, besides William Kemmler, who was executed in the electric chair in the 1890s in New York State, or even in the 1890s in the United States, you'll be able to do so. Our tool will make browsing and accessing information like this very easy. In 1987, Espy's research became the foundation for the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, or ICPSR. ICPSR's dataset, called Executions in the United States, 1608 to 1987, the Espy file. Our department's work involves reviewing the ICPSR data, reviewing Espy's original documentation, whether it was an index card or other materials, and linking the two. archivists also try to ensure there are no duplications between records. We're finding thousands of cases in ESPY's original papers that were not included in the ICPSR dataset. There are more cases that are underdocumented or extrajudicial. But this takes time, and our department is not quite halfway through this phase of the project. These selections that I've shared with you today simply highlight the breadth and scope of our National Death Penalty Archive. There's plenty more here. So please contact us via telephone, via email, via the web form on our website, or when it's safe to do so and you feel comfortable doing so, please come to visit us. We'd love to help you conduct research in our National Death Penalty Archive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jody. Thank you for that in-depth look into just a few of the primary sources contained in the National Death Penalty Archive collections. Before I bring back Dr. Acker, I want to just reinforce and underscore the work that we're doing with the ESPY collection that Jody mentioned. We have digitized all of the documents that ESPY collected, all of the index cards that he created, and they are now all available online. As Jody mentioned, our second phase of the project is to verify all of the metadata that was created in the 1987 ESPY file using the digitized documents. So when this project is finished, you'll be able to go to our website, search under person, date, state, many other means of searching, and you'll be allowed to view both the documents that ESPY collected as well as the index cards that he wrote. And we are planning an event for the fall 2021 or possibly the spring of 2022 to go into more detail about the ESPY projects and what sorts of qualitative and quantitative projects are possible by making all this material online. So again, thank you, Jody, for her presentation. Now on to the second part of our program this evening. Dr. Jim Acker will be sharing some selections from his capital punishment interview project. And if you don't know, Dr. Jim Acker is a recently retired distinguished professor of criminal justice from the University of Albany. He is also one of the co-founders of the National Death Penalty Archive and is currently one of the co-directors of the NDPA. So, Dr. Acker, I turn the floor over to you.
All right, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jody. What you've seen thus far is obviously just the tip of a very large iceberg. We do encourage you to consult the National Death Penalty Archive website. You can see the list of all of the collections. As Jody said, come visit in person, or as Brian and Jody both said, come take advantage of the collections that have been digitized and are available electronically. As Brian mentioned, I had the opportunity to chat with 8 prominent experts from around the country that deal with death penalty issues, either in scholarship or activism. We're going to play brief clips from those 8 interviews. And when they conclude, we'll inform you how to get a hold of the entire interviews that will be available to view. But the death penalty has been with us in this country for centuries. It predates the formation of the United States, going way well back into colonial times. There have been countless issues of concern and interest regarding capital punishment. Some of those have changed dramatically over time. Some have remained relatively constant. They're timeless. And in these clips, you'll see some of the issues that contemporary researchers and activist scholars have chosen to address. I want to thank all of the people who shared their expertise with us, spent time with these interviews. And I just mentioned that each and every one of the individuals that you'll see here has either used materials in the archives, visited the archives, or contributed to the archives, and some have done all. So again, thank you for the participation, and we'll roll the brief clips and then come back with a little bit more information about them. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Eugene Gill Wanger, Professor Marla Sandys, Diane Russ Tierney, Professor Michael Radlett, Professor Scott Phillips, Professor Michael Meltzner, Professor Daniel Coble, Professor Catherine Grasso. Thank you for your support of the National Death Penalty Archive.
At the bottom line, race matters. That's the bottom line, that anyone who asks me, race matters in how we administer criminal justice in this system. In a more sophisticated way, race matters in the selection of juries overwhelmingly and consistently. We have studied jury selection, the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in selecting jury members, peremptory strikes, right? In states all over this country. We just, we'll do one, they're not even published. Someone will say, will you analyze this for us and see if it matters? And it's stunning to me, the pervasive influence of race in jury selection in this country. And what's hopeful to me is what the state of Washington did in reforming jury selection, and now what the state of California have done. So they both have said, we recognize that these bases for excluding citizens from serving on juries are not helpful. They're racist, and we don't need them to select a fair jury. So they outlawed certain things like demeanor.
The clemency decision comes after the courts have concluded their review in almost every instance, because governors and parole boards don't want to make a decision needlessly. So if it is possible that the states will resolve this in the courts, they'll let the courts handle it. So the kinds of arguments that you are making are often non-legal arguments in the sense that they're not based on cases. Attorneys want to cite cases as reasons for clemency, but the kinds of grounds that decision makers have cited have been things like disparities in punishment. So someone is sentenced to death, but the more culpable individual in the crime, who either was the trigger man or the mastermind, got life imprisonment. So a disparity in the punishment that's imposed is one possible ground for it. In a recent case that I've been involved in, I made an argument to the Ohio Parole Board that we were applying the death penalty in a systemically racist fashion. Not that any one case was necessarily marred by an equal protection violation, but the fact that 57% of the men on death row are Black, when we have a 12% African-American population in Ohio, really suggests a systemic problem in implementing the death penalty.
It's kind of interesting that we're coming around full circle. There's no way in which the Supreme Court, which I think, quite as you say, has washed its hands of anything significant in this area, is going to abolish, although it might have been on the verge of it before the 2016 election with a slightly different Supreme Court. So instead, the move is back to the states and to the population, to the public. And what we found is that there are fewer cases where the death penalty is sought. There are fewer cases where juries decide on capital punishment as opposed to life or life without parole, or perhaps worried about the innocence movement. And there have been, I think, 7 legislatures which have abolished in this century. So the future of the death penalty is really in the hands of the public and the states.
The death penalty is just a microcosm of broader society. It's not special in a sense. It is a reflection of broader historical trends and problems that we've never fully addressed in the United States. And, you know, as your listeners know, some victims seem to, quote, matter more than others. The death of a white woman, especially a high status white woman, tends to send the system into overdrive. The death penalty is really overdrive for the system. And one way that I've thought about this is a death penalty case is an enormous amount of work. It's not simply going to be settled with a plea bargain. It's going to be two trials, really, a penalty trial after the guilt trial. It's going to be years of work in the appellate system to defend that conviction and defend that death sentence. And whose life and death is worthy of that additional effort? And the research says it's the life of a white victim, especially a white woman, and especially a high status victim. So I think the answer to the question is, if we, many of us are very interested in the death penalty, we read about it, we study it, but really it's just one aspect of a much broader set of circumstances in society.
Innocence is part of a larger argument about the death penalty, and that is the death penalty reserved for the worst of the worst? When we think of innocence, we think of people who legally and factually did not commit the crime. And, obviously they're not the worst of the worst. But we've got all sorts of other examples of people being sent to their deaths who were not the worst of the worst by any measure. People who have developmental disabilities, people who have long histories of abuse. As we speak now, in December of 2020, there are, right now we've already had 8 federal executions in the United States, and we've got 5 more scheduled before President Trump leaves office. But one of those people is a woman named Lisa Montgomery, not at all innocent. And you read the crime, she kidnapped a woman, cut a baby out of her uterus. She killed the woman, cut the baby out of the uterus. When you read it, anybody with half a brain is going to get sick to their stomach. But then you look at Lisa Montgomery's background. She was first raped at age 4. Her mom had, I think, 7 husbands who continually raped her, and their friends raped her. I mean, it's just a history of abuse that is equally horrible to the murder that Lisa Montgomery committed. One of my students the other day asked me if Ms. Montgomery had ever apologized for her crime, and I don't know if she has, but I know that we've not apologized for tolerating that kind of abuse.
If you look historically at how the death penalty has been used, it has always been used to say quite clearly which lives are worth more than others. You have seen from the time of slavery all through Jim Crow, where the same crimes did not carry the same punishment, where whether you get the death penalty or not depends on who you are and who your victim is. And so that is why we see that the death penalty is used disproportionately when victims are white, and in particular that people of color are disproportionately sentenced to death. And so one of the reasons that I am optimistic about us ending the death penalty ultimately is because I see that our country is on this path to really, for the first time, reckon with sort of the unfinished business of frankly, the Civil War. And we actually don't have a choice. We're confronting right now a very clear discussion about whether we're going to be a country that embraces and tolerates an ideology of white nationalism and white supremacy, or whether we're going to be a country that is actually going to try this incredible experiment of being a diverse, representative democracy.
Coming at it as a social scientist, not somebody trained in the law, there is this question of whether individuals are qualified to serve on a death penalty case. Or you could say, are they qualified to vote for a sentence of death? But that has, changed over time. But the whole idea behind death qualification is, can you serve on a death penalty case? And historically, the question really focused on, could you vote for a sentence of death? Right? Did you have any, so I often think of it as the pre-Witherspoon. Do you have any conscientious or religious scruples against the death penalty? And if so, you were excluded. And, it's obviously changed over time to where now there is this novelty of, could you also vote for life, right? I mean, historically, it was just, could your prospective jurors vote for a sentence of death, recognizing the awesome responsibility that that would involve. But then there was a realization that, wait a second, that process may result in individuals who couldn't consider even voting for a sentence of life. And so under the ideal circumstance, again, going back to what the law necessarily thinks about, is you want individuals who could consider aggravators and mitigators, decide on a sentence of death or life.
They're all of the issues: the conviction of the innocent, the whether or not the death penalty deterred murder, the racial discrimination and the death penalty. A number, in fact, there are about a dozen strong arguments, and I have files on all of them and books and pamphlets on almost all of them, and they can find those books and pamphlets in the collection. They go back to the 19th century, a few to the 18th century, but mostly 19th century, and of course early 20th century. And you can find the development of this right along, and you can find a great deal of the scientific material that was published in original form, like Ehrlich's papers, which purported to show using econometric analysis that the death penalty did deter, which created a tremendous stir when it came out. Well, I got all the original publications that have it, so that someone who wants to know the history of that and how we handled it in Michigan is, that's just one of the things they can find out by looking at the collections.
Well, all of those interviews were conducted between November of 2020, last year, and February of this year. The original interviews last roughly 15, 20, 25 minutes apiece. And for those of you who are interested in viewing them, my goodness, we could have kept talking for hours. These people know of which they speak, and it's fascinating material. We will be posting a link to the YouTube channel where all of these interviews will be posted and can be viewed. I again want to thank the participants. There's the confirmation of what I just said, that we will be providing that on the UAlbany YouTube channel. Well, you can read it. I can't talk it. I'm not good with this technological stuff. And in that vein, I want to first apologize to Scott Phillips. When you were watching the clips, Scott's picture was frozen, and that was through no fault of his, but we'll blame that on Zoom. We've all had these issues with Zoom, and while we were talking, the Zoom locked up and froze. But beyond that, that was the second interview I conducted with Scott. The first one, he spoke every bit as eloquently as in the second one, but I forgot to hit the record button, so not a word of it was preserved. So thank you, Scott, and thank each and every one of our experts. And while I'm thanking people, a heartfelt thanks to Diana Mancini, who put those edited clips together and who basically has organized and arranged for this entire forum. So she's a little camera shy, so she's not appearing right now, but we all thank you, Diana. While we're winding down here, let me just remind you that we hope to get some questions, and you can use that Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to pose those questions, and we'll try to address them. And I do want to remind you now that you have a better sense of some of the materials at your disposal. If you're a student looking for a dissertation or a master's thesis, or just to learn more about capital punishment, if you're in a professional circumstance where you really want to dig into materials about the death penalty, if you're simply an interested individual who found something that you'd like to learn a little bit more about, come visit the archive. It's on the 3rd floor of the Science Library at the UAlbany campus. Check out the website. As we've been saying, many of these collections are available, or portions of them, in electronic form. So we hope you do have some incentive now to follow up and use these materials. And the second reason, again, that we're wanting to share this information with you is to try to persuade that what we have going on here is of importance. The death penalty is a very important policy issue, legal issue, fraught with moral elements for both people who support, oppose, have not formed an opinion on capital punishment. But we want the archive to continue to build on this excellent foundation that we already have. So if anybody out there has materials that should be preserved and made available to others, we'd be delighted to learn more about them. You can contact Brian or myself at our email addresses here at the University at Albany. We'd love to hear from you, talk with you about what you have. And if you know somebody or of an organization that might have relevant materials, please let us know. And that is enough from me at this point. Let me turn it back to Brian for his last thoughts and words, and then we can maybe go to see what kinds of questions we have. So Brian.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Acker. Yeah, I would just reiterate what you were saying about continuing to add to the National Death Penalty Archive. Hopefully we won't be getting, we do have records from the Virginians against alternatives to the, or for alternatives to the death penalty. Now that Virginia has abolished the death penalty in their state, we are glad to hear that that organization will no longer be functioning. But we continue to work with organizations, especially both regional, statewide, and national organizations. Also individuals, if you're want some feedback or questions answered about what kinds of documents, whether it be paper or digital, that we accept into the Death Penalty Archive, I've been more than happy to discuss that with you. I think these interviews are excellent. I've watched them in their entirety. I strongly encourage you to go on the YouTube channel and to check them out. As we all know, this is a topic that unfortunately is not going away. There's much political work to be done, and activities will continue into the future. A challenge for us is that as we move into a digital age, it's much more challenging to preserve these born digital type electronic only records. So if you need assistance or any advice in that area, please don't hesitate to contact us. On the other side of that, if you're a researcher, a scholar, a student, a teacher, a journalist, or any other type of professional that is interested in gaining access to certain aspects of the death penalty archive, whether that's collections dealing with women on death row, issues such as executing the mentally ill, executing children, lethal injection. All of these topics are both contemporary and historical topics. And that's what really historians do. We connect the questions of today that we as a country are asking, and we try to trace that back into history and see how we got to where we are today. So with that, I have nothing more to add. I do hope folks have questions or comments while we're here today. I do see one Q&A question in the section there. So I don't know, Jim, do you see that question?
I'll be happy to read that question for you folks.
Okay.
It's from Catherine Grasso, and she is asking, will you please talk a little more about the range of scholars and lawyers who have made use of the archive, either in person or remotely so far?
I can answer that. This is Jody Boyle. I think as Professor Acker has mentioned, over the years, we've had a range of researchers, and that could range from, a senior at the University of Albany doing, a history capstone, which is a senior project, looking at, just one small aspect of materials in, one of the death penalty collections, maybe looking at just one case or just one type of document that you would find in a case. This could be someone from the general public, and I can think of one example of an individual using materials in the Espy papers, looking up material about her great uncle. No one would speak about her great uncle when she was growing up because he had been convicted of a murder in New York, and there was a great silence in her family about him. And she was simply interested in learning more. Well, we could provide a file's worth of information about him, and she went away quite satisfied because this information filled in the silence within her family that had persisted for decades about him. We've had a playwright visit us. We have the Babbitt collection. Manny Babbitt was executed in 1999 at San Quentin, and we have the contents of his cell at when he was taken for execution. And this playwright was looking to be inspired for writing her next play. And she simply sat in our reading room and she spread out the contents of his cell. And I remember her sitting there, and that was enough for her to be inspired by her, by the items themselves. Now, conversely, within more of the attorney area, I can remember an instance where we've had attorneys visit the department, not at the same time. There was a wrongful conviction for an individual. The attorneys visited the department at different times to use materials from different collections to both put their case together. An individual had been wrongfully convicted of murder, spent decades in prison, and they were coming to use materials, if I remember correctly, in the Valdez papers, to both the attorneys from both sides to put their cases together because he was subsequently suing the city that had convicted him. So we've had, again, the materials from the National Death Penalty Archive can be used by a range of individuals from a range of backgrounds for a range of purposes.
And I can, I mean, Jody gets a steady stream of inquiries. I know. I've recently finished reading a very recent book by Maurice Chama called Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty. And it's a book that focuses primarily on the history and evolution of capital punishment in the great state of Texas. But in the book, Mr. Chama acknowledges use of the death penalty archive and thanks Jody for her assistance. So that's one example. I've had occasion myself to use the Espy execution records in a recent article where myself and a co-author are trying to determine whether anybody has been executed after a jurisdiction repeals its death penalty law while individuals are still on death row. For example, Virginia just repealed its death penalty law, and there are two men on Virginia's death row. And under this legislation, they won't be executed. The statute says that their sentences will be commuted to life imprisonment without parole, but sometimes jurisdictions repeal or there's a judicial invalidation and people remain on death row. And what becomes of them? Should they be executed because they were lawfully sentenced before the repeal, or should they benefit from the repeal? Well, we didn't know. So we consulted the SB records, and they were very, very useful. I've also used some of Mike Radlett's work on innocence, but and there are lots and lots of scholars who've consulted about, as Jody said, clemency, race discrimination, jury decision making, and so forth. So we're delighted too that it's getting such use.
Thank you.
I would just add one little thing to that. And one of the things as a historian, right? Historians aren't writing about last year or 2 years ago. They're really just starting to delve into that late 20th century period, really, from the 60s onward, when the issue of capital punishment becomes such a large issue in the national discourse. So part of our mission is providing sources for scholars today, but we also have our eyes pointed towards 50 years from now, 150 years from now, when people will be looking at these documents, trying to understand what we were thinking in the late 20th century in terms of capital punishment. So we do have that short range view of assisting scholars now, but we're looking long range. And because so many people that were involved in those issues in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are still around and active, we have the opportunity to reach out to them and get those records into the archive.
Thank you. That was great. We don't have any other questions in our Q&A right now, but I do have a question that we discussed sort of briefly the other day. And that is, do you know what the oldest item is in the archive? Of course, Jody does.
I do. This is not the oldest item in the department overall. However, the oldest item in the National Death Penalty Archive is in the Wanger collection. So we have a 1701 essay in the Wanger collection. It's entitled "Hanging, Not Enough Punishment for Murderers." It's by an anonymous author, and it was published in London. And Mr. Wanger, though, does note that it is possible that it was an early 18th century reproduction. So that would mean the earliest original item in the archive might be still within the Wanger collection, a 1754 item entitled "Proposals to the Legislature for Preventing the Frequent Executions and Exportations of Convicts," also published in London. And the author is a student of politics. And it argues against capital punishment for lesser crimes. Now, within the SB papers, we have a copy of a 1730 colonial court order to execute an individual in Massachusetts. The original is in the Massachusetts State Archives.
Thank you. Very interesting. I don't see any other questions coming in, but I do want to remind folks we will be in touch after the webinar with the links that we've been providing in the chat. So if you have any questions for our panelists after the webinar ends, you're welcome to respond to that email, and I will pass the questions along and get answers for you. Would anyone like to say any closing remarks before we end for the evening?
Just another thanks, and use the materials at your disposal. And if you have materials that need preservation and should be shared and for historical and other purposes, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you.